While proponents of the bill invoke national security, the many opponents of the measure believe that not only will it make America less safe, but it is an ongoing attempt to vilify Muslims, cripple American Muslim civil society, and feeds into the Islamophobia industry. Now, because of vigorous pushback from civil rights and civil libertarian activists, the bill, which seemed imminent in February, has now been essentially put on hold. And for that reason, we have the space and time now to discuss this issue in a more rational and critical way. Our esteemed panel of scholars, civil rights activists, and legal experts will explore the implications of designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization, specifically on the American Muslim community. Currently, there is not a central place where journalists, activists, policymakers, and scholars interested in the issue can learn about all the different dimensions of this issue, of this topic. So for that reason, ISPU has created a landing page that's a one-stop resource for a number of resources looking at the implication of the designation. You can find it at ispu.org/MB designation. Now, ISPU is a nonpartisan research organization and therefore does not necessarily endorse the views expressed either on the website or on this panel. Rather, this conversation is meant to help inform interested parties on the multidimensional implications of this kind of a designation, specifically on the American Muslim community. You're going to hear from each of our panelists, then we're going to engage them in discussion, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. Each of you has a note card and a pen on your seat, so please use that to write down your questions. We also have an online audience via Facebook Live. Hello and welcome. Please also submit questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can. For anyone posting on social media, please use the hashtag MB designation. With that, let's introduce our panel. I'll start with Angie, who will be speaking first. Angie Abdelkader is a full-time faculty member at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, where she teaches courses on international terrorism and human rights, as well as civil liberties and national security. An award-winning attorney and scholar, she has worked with Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians since 9/11 to address Islamophobia. We also have Hina Shamsi. She is the director of the ACLU National Security Project, which is dedicated to ensuring that U.S. national security policies and practices are consistent with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. She engages in litigation, research, and public and policy advocacy on issues including freedom of speech, association, targeted killing, torture, unlawful detention, privacy and surveillance, and discrimination against racial and religious minorities. We also have Corey Saylor. He directs the Department to Monitor and Combat Islamophobia at the Council on American Islamic Relations. Corey Saylor's expertise covers advocacy, media relations, and Islamophobia in America. His writings document the civil rights impact of anti-Islam prejudice and the groups promoting such bias. Saylor has run successful advocacy campaigns against several corporate giants when their actions negatively impact the American Muslim community. And finally, Michael German. He is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program, which seeks to ensure that our government respects human rights and fundamental freedoms in conducting the fight against terrorism. His work focuses on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. And with that, I'm going to start with Angie Abdelkader, who will set the foundation for our discussion today.
Good afternoon. So I want to thank the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding for bringing us together for this important conversation and allowing me to share my insights. Specifically, I was asked to share some context for today's conversation, so that's what I'm going to do. So about a year ago, on August 15, 2016, in Youngstown, Ohio, then Republican presidential nominee Donald J. Trump delivered a speech titled Understanding the Threat, Radical Islam in the Age of Terror, to a crowd of his supporters. With Election Day just months away, the multi-million-dollar businessman turned reality television show star detailed his plans to make America safe again, and eradicating, quote, radical Islamic terrorism featured prominently in that discussion. In his remarks, Trump described radical Islam as a formidable threat to domestic security, a popular narrative surrounding Muslims and Islam in contemporary America. He cited the assault on the Fort Hood in Texas, the Boston Marathon bombing, the mass shooting in San Bernardino, California, as well as the assault on the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, to support his argument. Several months later, in January of 2017, earlier this month, and after Trump succeeded in his presidential bid, the Triangle Center at Duke University published a research report that suggests that Trump may have overstated his claims. It showed that violent extremism was in fact down by 40% in the American Muslim community. In fact, it also showed that more Americans died at the hands of non-Muslims committing mass shootings in a single year of 2016 than in any of the assaults that Trump had mentioned by Muslims over the course of the past 15 years cumulatively. So more Americans died in mass shootings by non-Muslims in the 1 year of 2016 than in the 15 past years in terror assaults committed by self-identifying Muslims. Still, according to research from Chapman University, Americans are more afraid of terrorism than just about anything except for government corruption. And those aspiring to political office, those yearning for power and votes to get them that power, often manipulate public fears to achieve a political agenda. Trump's remarks in Ohio are significant and relevant to the instant discussion that we're gathered here to have, for a number of reasons. First, this particular speech would become a template or a blueprint for his plan to counter, quote, radical Islam. And it was highlighted in precisely this manner on his campaign website. In fact, most of the initiatives relating to counterterrorism that we saw in his first 100 days in office were outlined in this particular speech in Ohio. Second, the national security narrative in Trump's Ohio remarks is often leveraged by elected officials to introduce discriminatory laws and policies. Glaring examples of this are both versions of the de facto Muslim ban, where Trump declared upon signing, quote, I am establishing a new vetting measure to keep radical Islamic terrorists out of the United States of America. We don't want them here. This, despite intelligence reports from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security showing little connection between violent extremism and citizenship or country of origin. Another lesser-known legislative initiative, also ostensibly designed to eradicate the security threat posed by so-called radical Islam, is the push to criminalize the Muslim Brotherhood, a group whose leaders have publicly renounced ideologically motivated violence. As Delia mentioned, Senator Ted Cruz introduced the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act in early January of this year. And companion legislation was also filed in the U.S. House of Representatives, urging the U.S. State Department to find or designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. Cruz's office published a statement at that time, asserting that the measure would, quote, protect Americans from the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. He also said, I am proud to reintroduce this bill that would codify needed reforms in America's war against radical Islamic terrorism. This potent threat to our civilization has intensified under the Obama administration due to the willful blindness of politically correct policies that hamper our safety and security. Of course, the reference to the alleged civilizational threat is a copy and paste from the Islamophobia network, a multi-million-dollar industry of anti-Muslim activists and extremists who now enjoy relationships with high-level officials within the White House as well as members of Congress. One such individual is Frank Gaffney, who heads up the Center for Security Policy. He's claimed for years that American Muslims are involved in a nefarious, surreptitious bid to overtake the United States from within, and that Muslim civil society are nothing more than a front for the Muslim Brotherhood to do just that. It is for that reason that Cruz's bill is widely viewed as a thinly veiled attempt to further marginalize, stigmatize, and criminalize the American Muslim community. While Cruz's bill is the most recent in a series of legislative attempts to render the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists, there are those who are also lobbying the White House to do just that via an executive order. On its face, this effort is part of a broader conservative battle against so-called radical Islam. Still, for all the blustery rhetoric about eradicating that threat, the Muslim Brotherhood has never actually been linked to a terrorist attack in the United States. And while proponents of such a measure point to almost half a dozen international designations to support their argument, most of those decisions were actually motivated by politics as opposed to credible evidence of involvement with terrorist activity. In Egypt, for instance, the organization was designated in the aftermath of a military coup that toppled democratically elected President Mohamed Morsi, who also happened to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. When a local police station was bombed in 2013, new government officials were quick to designate the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, even though the group condemned the bombing and another group actually claimed responsibility for it. That action by the Egyptians was so egregious that Human Rights Watch issued a public condemnation because the designation was clearly politically motivated as opposed to based on credible evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Shortly thereafter, the Saudis also designated the group a terrorist organization, largely influenced by the Egyptians and their own anxieties surrounding the intensity and the fervor of the so-called Arab Spring, which at that point had enjoyed some success in Tunisia and until the coup in Egypt as well. So a royal decree in the kingdom rendered the group a terrorist organization without any credible evidence of a threat or acts of violence. So in other words, the designations that are touted as evidence to support the domestic initiative to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization actually have little or nothing to do with radical Islam or global security. And back here at home in the United States, it has everything to do with fear, politics, and prejudice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MJ. Next, we'll hear from Anna. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, a couple of things to just pick up on from both what Dalia said and what MG said to frame my comments as I go into the civil liberties and rights-based issues that arise in this particular context. One is, and I should preface this saying that the ACLU doesn't take positions on foreign policy issues, but we are obviously very concerned about due process concerns. But to realize two things at the outset. One, back in January, I think there seemed to be a real risk of imminent designation or moving forward of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that risk has dissipated, exactly as Dalia said, in huge part because of pushback. And that's a very good thing, but I think it would still be important to be aware of the resurgence of the push, because certainly those who wanted it in the first place have not stopped wanting it, even as we recognize and sort of temper our own reactions, because there's so much to do right now in this administration with respect to issues to be concerned about. Second, to pick up on a point that MG made, which is just to recognize how political this entire process is. It's the politics coming from a foreign policy segment, including Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia for their own reasons. And then there's the domestic politics, this long-running view of spurious, factless connections between posed, purported foreign threat and the domestic otherized threat that used to be a fringe extremist view and is now in the White House. And so with that as a backdrop, I wanted to talk about the two different kinds of schemes that were really at issue here. The foreign terrorist organization scheme, as well as one that people know, I think, less about sometimes, which is a scheme with respect to specially designated global terrorists. Absolutely, Senator Cruz, others, and this is again a long-standing fringe view, have sought to achieve or get responses from executive branch officials about why they would not designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. So let's just look a little bit about what that designation does and what the consequences could be for domestic civil society, which is really one of my main areas of focus. So the common aspect with both the FTO scheme and the SDGT scheme, and I'm sorry to be using alphabet soup, but it can make things go a little bit more quick, is that both have extraordinarily broad criteria and both have draconian consequences. Without getting into the specifics of the criteria for each scheme, for the FTO scheme, you have to be foreign, exactly what it sounds like. The terrorism connection or support can be massively attenuated and does not necessarily require an actual physical act of terrorism, but can be based on risk assessments. And the scheme essentially freezes the assets of a designated entity, and any transaction with that entity, including with respect to US financial institutions, can result in investigation, prosecution, and criminal sanctions. With respect to the consequences for domestic organizations, what really comes into play, I think, is the risk of material support investigations and prosecutions. And material support investigations and prosecutions here in the United States have already been extremely politicized and are based often, again, on facts that are far, far attenuated from an actual ability and even sometimes an intent to carry out a violent act. And very much implicates First Amendment issues of freedoms of association and speech and belief, even in that particular context. I'll throw out another source of concern, which is designation of an FTO can then invite investigation prosecution by entities domestically, like the FBI, which in its Domestic Intelligence Operations Guide claims the authority to conduct very intrusive investigations without requiring an actual factual predicate to believe in wrongdoing. So think about designation as having ripple effects of consequences with massive civil liberty concerns for people in American Muslim communities, which is exactly the aim and intent of those who are seeking to advance these schemes. But let me also focus a little bit on the SDGT scheme, because this is one where the entity being designated can be foreign. It could be applied to the Muslim Brotherhood, whatever the Muslim Brotherhood is and however we define the Muslim Brotherhood. But it can also be applied to domestic organizations. And so you could imagine a scenario in which there is an FTO designation and then investigation of domestic organizations here in the United States under not just the criminal schemes, material support schemes that I just talked about briefly, but also under the specially designated global terrorist scheme, which also has extraordinarily vague and broad criteria, and then does this. Congress gave the president, and we're talking about extremely broad powers, Congress gave the president the authority to block pending investigation of a specially designated global terrorist. So all the consequences of designation in this particular context, which is shutting down of financial transactions, including through any entity's accounts, essentially criminalizing potentially any kind of support, very broadly defined, to the designated or to the entity under suspicion without actually designating it. And we know how this has happened from a couple of different cases, one of which I litigated with the ACLU, Kind Hearts for Charitable Humanitarian Development, and Al Haramain Islamic Foundation. And so here's where I think it's important to think through the pushback, especially with domestic organizations, which is not to throw our hands up in the air, not that I think anyone would do that, but to insist upon the constitutional rights and entitlements that Muslim civil society organizations and individuals have. The courts in both of those cases found that critical procedural protections are necessary under the 4th and 5th Amendments when a US person has its assets blocked pending an investigation or is designated a global terrorist. There are 4th Amendment safeguards against unreasonable seizures, and the courts in both Kind Hearts and Al Haramain held that the government has to obtain a warrant based upon probable cause before blocking a US person's assets. There are also protections under the 5th Amendment. The 5th Amendment's Due Process Clause provides protection against deprivation of property without notice and a meaningful opportunity to challenge. And again, in both the Kind Hearts and Al Haramain cases, the government claimed the authority to blacklist, which is what this is, organizations and individuals with virtually no procedural or substantive safeguards before or after the fact. The court said no, and that the government couldn't effectively shut down organizations without providing a notice or a hearing and a meaningful opportunity to be heard. Now, there are other challenges and other rights at stake. First Amendment rights, which was an issue in Al Haramain, and especially if these, if any kind of action is targeted against Muslim communities or primarily Muslim communities, then the thing to do would be to bring the kind of challenge that we and so many others have brought under the Muslim ban, including on Establishment Clause grounds, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and other grounds. That said, and I always point this out, litigation often takes time. We engage in it, it's necessary to do, but the time also to act is in advance and before such things happen in order to prevent them and the very real harms that could come. So, and I know Corey's going to talk about this, but I won't, and so I won't labor this, but I do think that there is real concern, probably for more of the national organizations that are named in media accounts, and it would be important for groups or entities that are concerned about these issues to consult with lawyers, and really to talk with lawyers who have experience, and I'm not just saying us, there are many others, but lawyers who have experience with the intersection of national security and designation and prosecution issues, because the ramifications can cover all of those areas. They can have criminal consequences, they may have immigration consequences, and unfortunately we're living in a world where people do not have to have done anything wrong to be called out or to be persecuted in particular contexts. And without having done anything wrong, it is still a good idea to protect yourself, right? Thank you.
Next we'll hear from Corey.
Good afternoon, and I want to echo the appreciation to the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding for inviting us all to speak today. But I want to also add thank you to my panelists, many of whom have worked very hard on this issue, and then also thanks to all of you for having the interest to take time out of your day and join us. For the U.S. Islamophobia Network, this entire issue is about the criminalization of its political opposition. The entire idea in my book originated in the U.S. Islamophobia Network during the Holy Land Foundation trial. And since then, they have been working to seek a designation of the Muslim Brotherhood because of the impact it would have on groups that are their political opposition in the United States. And given the current environment today, the Trump administration's unique hostility to Muslims, I think the U.S. Islamophobia Network feels more empowered on this issue than they have in a long time. When you look at Muslim civil society today, though, I think in terms of this issue, what you will find is that there's an awareness that you have both the Cruz bill in Congress and this discussion about a potential executive order. But that awareness isn't really interfering in these organizations' commitment to their core work. And I think that's one of the most important things right now. The whole idea of a designation is meant to inspire fear in Muslim civil society. And what we've been seeing is instead, in the wake of the Trump election, that donations for just about every organization went up, that the women's marches showed the energy that exists in the community to stand up against what it sees as a pendulum swing in the wrong direction for American values, and that many of these organizations, when you look at what happened in the wake of the Holy Land Foundation designation of groups as unindicted co-conspirators, many of these groups have more advocacy experience, they have stronger alliances in civil society around the country, they have more access to legal protections. These things have resulted in less of a sense of anxiety today about the Muslim Brotherhood designation issue than you saw a sense of anxiety in the wake of the Holy Land Foundation designations. That doesn't mean they're unaware of it, but what that means is that the core work, for instance at CARE, is protecting people's civil rights and making sure everybody has equal access and protections under the law. That does not go away. But let's look at what might happen. The long announced sort of key targets to the idea of a Muslim Brotherhood designation are really three groups that are frequently mentioned. And then there's one that's sort of an aside that's worth pointing out as well. But when you look at these total of 4 groups, and I describe who they are, I think you'll get a sense of how exactly far-reaching this intended designation is and why it is such a highly held goal for the Islamophobia Network. So among the 4 groups that are usually discussed is North American Islamic Trust, an organization that holds the real estate assets of Islamic centers and schools in more than 40 states. So we're talking a very widespread institution that oversees the education of young people and places of worship for hundreds and thousands of Muslims across the country. Then you have the Islamic Society of North America, one of the largest umbrella groups for American Muslims in this country. They oversee educational programs, conventions, and also are affiliated with a large number of places of worship. You have the organization I work for, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is one of the premier institutions protecting the civil rights of American Muslims in this country through the use of lawsuits, through the use of advocacy. And then the group that's not usually mentioned in those core three, but also when you read the literature and the writings of the U.S. Islamophobia Network, you have the Muslim Students Association, which is essentially represented wherever you have Muslims on a college campus in this country. I wanted to give you those four groups because I think when I talk about it in that kind of detail, you understand when I say the criminalization of your political opposition, that's what we mean in a very impactful way. Because opening the door on these four groups opens the door on practically every aspect of Muslim civil society. And what does that look like? Well, a couple of the previous speakers have already alluded to it, but I want you to keep in mind that in these conversations, which are mostly political, and because of the broad authority that government has in this, facts don't matter as much as perception. So in these conversations, the perception that you might be associated with the Muslim Brotherhood can trigger consequences for you. And that's why for the last 10 or so years, the groups that seek to restrict American Muslim voice in civic society have gone to great lengths to essentially associate everyone with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I mean, this goes to people like Grover Norquist has been associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, Huma Abedin, any number of individuals. In many ways, we call it Islamic whack-a-mole. If you rise up too high, the hammer will come down on your head, and you will be accused of this. And as a result, you have difficulty advancing what your contribution to American civil society and America's conversation, because you then have to deal with this reputational issue that's hanging over you. So institutionally, what a designation could mean, in many ways, is an effective shutdown. You don't have to have done anything actually illegal for you to be shut down and examined, and 10 years later, oh, by the way, sorry, there was nothing there. At that point in time, your institution is gone. Also, on a more reputational level, we can look at the weight of the Holy Land Foundation designation as an indicator. So reputationally, the groups that were designated to this day continue to deal with that designation in their dealings with government, in their dealings with donors, and in their dealings with just regular average individuals. Which means that instead of being able to pursue equal protection for people, equal access, all the things that these groups that are working to uphold the Bill of Rights are looking for, they're dealing with reputational issues. Even to the point, and this goes back to my comment about perception being more important than facts. Speaking about CARE in particular, a couple of years after the unindicted co-conspirator designation of CARE, Attorney General Holder in 2011 is on the record as saying, and this is a paraphrase, but they looked at the facts in the law and where it pertained to CARE, there was nothing there. He got attacked for that, saying, it was a political thing and he was politically motivated to make those statements. So James Jacks, the prosecutor in the Holy Land Foundation trial, who was a career in the U.S., his entire career was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, came out and he said essentially the same thing. All of this in 2011. And despite having these two very significant names, these reputational issues remain to this day. So the legal side of it put to bed in 2011. The reputational side of it ongoing, still used as a club still uses a handle. Now, if you go with the Muslim Brotherhood designation, you get that same impact just on steroids. And then the last thing to look at is how this affects the average individual. So as we go around the country these days, in just about every appearance I make, somebody will come up to me afterward and ask me about this designation. So to say it has caused a lot of anxiety on the individual level for individual Muslims is an understatement. And what that results in is a very significant chilling of Muslim participation in civil society. Muslims have opinions on any number of issues, and yet people become afraid to engage in that very thing that defines our democratic ideals. It also means there is this fear to be associated with these groups. So, yes, I already mentioned there was significant generosity toward a number of organizations in the wake of the Trump administration. But you still hear individuals asking, can I donate to any one number of a variety of groups who've been falsely accused of being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood? People hold back. So the average individual who wants to have a role in public life, who wants to contribute to their society, who may have that idea that could solve significant problems in our country, are afraid to speak up simply because of this. And I would say at the end of the day, that is the goal of the Islamophobia Network, who inspired, first of all, Michelle Bachmann to introduce the legislation designating them, that essentially in many ways Ted Cruz cut and paste and turned into his legislation now, and has inspired the conversations about an executive order. Thank you very much.
Michael?
Thank you very much, and thanks to Dahlia for having me here, and to my co-panelists who I think have covered this issue so well. It leaves very little for me to say, but that's never stopped me before. So I think NG has framed this very well, that this is really about fear, politics, and prejudice. And we have to understand that the effort to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization is part of a larger effort to identify Islam or some version of Islam as the problem, as the threat to American security. And that includes not just the designation of foreign terrorist organizations, but the conception of the problem of terrorism as one of ideological radicalization, right? And this has developed all sorts of different enforcement programs and intelligence gathering programs, including countering violent extremism, which, again, as we've already discussed, there are a lot of different political and religious and ideological groups that engage in violence. So the idea that we would have a countering violent extremism program that only focused on Muslims, I think, showed how this concept was being used to stigmatize, divide, and sow fear within Muslim communities. And so, starting with fear, and it's interesting when I talk to young audiences who have grown up into adulthood since 9/11, we have this perception that we're living during a time of increased terrorism, when in fact that's not true, right? That actually this is one of the periods of incredible safety in the United States since the 9/11 attacks. If you look just to when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, there were far more terrorism attacks in the United States, more Americans being killed by terrorists, but we didn't treat it as a national security threat. We treated it as a criminal activity, and that has declined steadily since then. And particularly when you look at the way the Trump campaign tried to use this as one element of a fear campaign, right? So it wasn't just the drumbeat Muslim terrorism as the problem and radical Islam as the problem, but this concept of fear of crime, right? That there is this increase in urban crime that is part of the problem, when in fact, again, if you look at the data, that's not true. Urban crime is at historic lows. Obviously there are some cities where there are increases, like Chicago and Baltimore, unfortunately, but overall, homicides are down. But as homicides have come down since highs in the 90s, something else has come down, and that is the homicide clearance rate. The number of homicides solved has come down even as the number of homicides have come down. Right? Today, half of the violent crime in the United States goes unsolved. That includes a third of the murders, and it includes 60% of the rapes. Right? Somehow we don't consider that terrorism. So we're putting these national security resources into something that is actually a very rare threat. And rather than actually taking care of all the citizens in our country from all the threats that they face. So part of this idea is to ratchet up this problem as more important, a bigger security threat than it actually deserves. But it also misdirects the resources going to those, going to actual security by taking resources away from general crime and putting it into these intelligence and surveillance programs that are then only further corrupted by this flawed notion of radicalization. Right? So the government has had this very simplistic idea that terrorism is a process, a mental process, that you go through this procedure where you are exposed to radical ideas, and eventually you adopt these radical ideas and then you become a terrorist. Now, empirical studies of terrorism show this is absolutely false. It is not true. The people who commit acts of terrorism typically do not have deep ties into any particular ideology or hold particularly strong views. It's a much more complex problem than that. But here, the trick that politicians like to do is make the problem very simple. And as Corey suggested, identify the political opposition as the problem. Right? So if we can say that this problem is these bad ideas, then the solution becomes very easy. Suppress these bad ideas, suppress this political opposition, and that way we'll accomplish what the entity wants to do from a political standpoint. Again, this has nothing to do with security. And I think we can see this when the only thing I disagree with anything my co-panelist said is Corey taking this back to the Holy Land Foundation trial. I actually take it back a little bit further to 1917 when Congress actually had its first radicalization hearings. I'm sure we all remember the House Homeland Security hearings on radicalization. Just last May, I testified in Ted Cruz hearing on radical Islam. But the first radicalization hearing actually took place in 1917. It was called the Overman Committee. And what they were looking at was initially a concept of American support of German propaganda during the war. Right? So the idea was that certainly we're in the war with Germany. They have agents here in the United States who are trying to undermine our war effort at home by issuing pro-German propaganda. So therefore, anybody in the United States who is reinforcing any pro-German ideas must be in league with our enemies and out to subvert it. So if you're looking for this hearing, it's actually focused on the Brewers Association because, of course, Germans like beer. And it really is that simple. And then it changed after the Russian Revolution to focus on the supposed dangerous spread of Bolshevism. And the idea, as expressed by the government agents at the time, the FBI and the military, was that certainly there was a lot of anarchist violence. But that wasn't really the biggest problem. The problem was the intellectuals spreading the ideas that led to violence. And so that was when this concept of radicalization was first formed in the United States, and it developed the same way. The idea the government had for the solution was draw up a long list of people with bad ideas and watch those people, right? So just like the watch list that we've developed in our current situation, none of these are new ideas. This was a way of identifying people who were part of the labor movement, who were part of the civil rights movement, who were part of the anti-war movement, and painting them as being in league with the enemy. And that way you could marginalize not just the very few people who might actually do harm. That's not really part of it. The idea is to marginalize your political opposition. And of course, it was true again when J. Edgar Hoover initiated COINTELPRO during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where the ideology that was problematic was communism. And the way that you undermined any political opposition was linking it, associating it with communism. And so when the civil rights movement began, it was easy to say, well, this person knows that person and used to work with this person, and we can do this guilt by association to paint this entire political community as in league with the enemy. And the difference that we have now was a tool that J. Edgar Hoover didn't have, which is this concept of designating an entity. The idea that you're doing is not just criminalizing an entire organization, not just the people who engage in criminal acts within it, but particularly when you talk about a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, which really isn't an organization, it's much more diffuse than that. But it's not just that you're criminalizing that entity, it's that you're criminalizing anyone who associates with that entity, and then anyone who associates with those who associate with them. So this is a very dangerous power to give to the government to do this in political situations. And for anyone who thinks, well, this is affecting people abroad, this is not affecting me, these aren't ideas I hold, I don't associate with those groups. What we know from history is these things only spread. And part of the interesting dialogue that is starting, because it becomes very difficult to continue refuting the facts, people are acknowledging that far-right extremist groups kill more people in the United States on an average year than any other group. So there are discussions of, well, let's start designating domestic groups, right? So I think any one of us can hold some idea that is outside the mainstream, whether that's in politics or in your social life or what sports teams you root for. The idea that these ideas themselves, because they are not mainstream, are actually dangerous is antithetical to the notion of American democracy. And I think we have to be very careful about making sure that we're holding the government responsible and actually focusing on what is the problem. Because the other part of this is distracting from what are real problems, right? There are real problems in the Middle East, and there are real problems in these countries. But if we pretend that it's just a problem of extremist groups, that creates one solution. If your enemy is a fanatic, there's no reason to negotiate, there's no reason to find a political solution. The only solution is to destroy them. And we are on a course, because we have so identified the problem as a problem of extremism, we're on a course for permanent warfare with all of the degradations to civil and human rights that go along with it. And unless we start recognizing that these are not, right? I mean, it's funny with this concept of radical Islam, when I testified in Ted Cruz's hearing, it's this term that encompasses the views of ISIS, which I think we would all acknowledge are very radical and outside the mainstream, and Al-Qaeda likewise. But also Hezbollah and Hamas and Saudi Arabia and the government of Iran, right? So the concept that Ted Cruz and others of the world who liken the enemy to radical Islam lumps these groups all together in this one global conspiracy. without seeming to acknowledge that they're actually all in mortal combat with one another. And the idea that they have a common conspiratorial goal is just utter nonsense. But I think if you look at the U.S. reaction in Syria and Iraq particularly, but also in Yemen, it flows into that, right? I mean, we have this very rigorous prohibition against providing material support for terrorist groups. But we're actually supporting Kurdish groups in these countries that are aligned with the PKK, a U.S. designated foreign terrorist group. We're supporting Iraqi militias and that either themselves are designated by the United States or are working in cooperation with the Iranian Quds Force, which is a U.S. designated terrorist group. So it's no longer that you can't support a terrorist group, it's that you just can't support the wrong terrorist group at the wrong time, right? And I think that's where we have to get away from this concept of identifying this problem as something other than it is, because the only way we're going to solve it is if we start focusing on what the real problems are. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So as we collect questions from the audience, let me go ahead and start. We should turn that one on. You all made, I think, a very compelling case for the implications for the American Muslim community, the danger of this designation on the community. But if someone is watching or thinking about this and they're not a Muslim, why should they care? Who would like to start answering that question? Why should you care if you're not a Muslim?
It goes back to what I started my remarks with, the criminalization of your political opposition. So look at what we've seen in the United States in the last few years. You had Acorn, a community service group, a video that was heavily edited, making Acorn look bad, was released. Ultimately, they were cleared of doing anything wrong. And yet that resulted in Acorn being defunded and now no longer existing. You have the clear targeting of Planned Parenthood at this point in time for defunding as well. But this takes it to a different level, where you're not just using heavily edited videos, false facts, and other things to take away funding. You're actually looking to criminalize. And we have to recognize from what Mike was saying that while Muslims may be one of the groups in the lens right now, that is going to change at some point in time. It always has. So historically, when you look at different religious movements in the United States, Catholics at one point in time were reviled, the things said about people of the Jewish faith, absolutely obnoxious. I at one point in time was on CNN defending Mitt Romney when he was running for president, because people were saying if he became president, the Mormon Church would be running the country. So that lens that's on Muslims right now is going to change. And if the door for criminalizing your political opposition is opened, then it will begin to be applied to whoever the favorite bad guy of the day is, which means you will see a movement of a very healthy, robust debate in the United States to everybody minding their own business and a few people getting to have the conversation.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that question?
That's good. Go ahead. I think it's important to keep in mind, I mean, it's fascinating that I do do a lot of speaking on these topics where we're talking about national security, and it's rarely acknowledged that we're a nation that's been at war for more than 15 years, right? I mean, we are collectively sending our men and women abroad into conflict and putting them at risk and their lives at risk and engaged in difficult situations that are destroying countries, right? So this is something that we have a collective responsibility for, and we should understand that we only should be using those forces, number one, in a way that's effective, right? That we're not putting people in harm's way for no good reason at all. But number two, had some sort of conclusion. And with the continued discussion and unfortunately amplified discussion, I agree with Corey that taking what were these fringe Islamophobic groups and giving them purchase in the administration is something very dangerous. And for the people who don't know, I was an FBI agent for 16 years and did a lot of undercover work in far-right groups and neo-Nazi groups, and therefore have an appreciation for how authoritarianism works. And one of the key elements is always finding a minority community that you can demonize and stigmatize, and accumulate power by pointing at the dangerous other. And I see a lot of that in what this administration is doing. And as Corey has suggested, that just because it's not your group or your political ideology that's being pointed at today doesn't mean it's not the one that's going to be pointed at tomorrow.
So personally, I believe that our experiences are interconnected, and our legal rights are interdependent across space and time. So what do I mean by that? How many of you are familiar with the case of Korematsu versus the United States? I see a few hands up. Essentially, this relates to an executive order that Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed into effect back in 1942 in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. And essentially, it facilitated the internment of Japanese Americans at that time. Fred Korematsu was an American of Japanese descent who engaged in an act of civil disobedience by not complying with that executive order. He was arrested for engaging in a civil act of disobedience, and that is what gave rise to that litigation that ultimately found itself in the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1944 issued a decision, 6-3, so strong majority there, in favor of the executive order, finding that it was constitutional for the President of the United States to engage in that sort of racial discrimination because it was a time of war. So again, we see this use of the national security narrative, and Fred Korematsu's conviction was upheld, and he was in fact interned with 100,000 Japanese Americans at that time, again, in the name of national security. So back in the 1940s, were there Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians residing here in the United States? Absolutely. Were they thinking that that executive order might affect them or their descendants in some 60 to 70 years? No. And so that's how our experiences are interconnected and our rights are interdependent across space and time. To think of that executive order as being about Japanese Americans is short-sighted, much in the same way that to think about what we're talking about today regarding the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as being just about the Muslim Brotherhood is short-sighted. What we're talking about is the underlying action, which is reducing law and policy to instruments of persecution and oppression to affect a political end, right? And that can affect anyone at any time. It just happens to be the Muslim Brotherhood at this given time, because they happen to be a cause or group that's been rendered unpopular, that makes us feel uncomfortable. So this has nothing to do with whether or not you support the Muslim Brotherhood or what your opinion is of their ideology or their actions. It has everything to do about who we are. And once we concede that territory to elected officials, once we allow our laws and policies to be manipulated in this way, everyone becomes vulnerable. And that's why you should care.
There's so many different ways to respond to this question. It's something I struggle with a lot. So let me start out with what I don't think the response is, which is that this approach or what people are proposing will make us any safer. It absolutely will not. It will make more people less safe, including especially people here in this country who are targeted. One of the things that I also have really found is limiting and want to push back against is this notion that we should have equality or justice or fairness with respect to minority rights so that minorities will cooperate with law enforcement, right? And so that minorities will be able to go to law enforcement and so on. That perpetuates, I think, the fundamental problem here, which is looking at portions of our communities solely or primarily through a security lens, right? When what's truly radical, when the reason that we not just give lip service to, but hopefully action to why we have civil rights and civil liberties is so that I, as a Muslim, do not have to justify my humanity to you as a non-Muslim. My equal rights to belief, to security that we all are entitled to freedoms of thought and association, the limit comes if I commit a crime. We all agree on that. Unless we're at that point, we shouldn't be looking at Muslims as on the verge of committing a crime, on the verge of being a threat, which is essentially what this all does. And what it results in then is hands-on, consequences that have been applied throughout this country's history on each of its many disfavored minorities, right? Consequences in the workplace, bullying in schools, children feeling insecure, young people not achieving their full potential. That's what the promise of equality and fairness is supposed to protect against. And to make that real for all of us is something that, for exactly the reasons you're talking about, interconnectedness, that's what it requires of all of us.
Okay, so I'm going to take some questions from the floor. One question here is on options for what to do in case this happens. So we're talking about the implications, but the question is, if the Muslim Brotherhood designation comes through the White House, what should American Muslims do? What political options do they have available to them to prevent this kind of a designation, if it is indeed an executive order?
So just to be clear about a couple of things. So with respect to the FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, the way that that's set up is that it is done by the Secretary of State in conjunction with the Department of Treasury and the Attorney General. But I think what this goes back to is that under authorities, under a particular 1977 statute, Congress gave the President the authority to by executive order, which is essentially one of the things that Bush did, because this has sort of happened before, designate foreign organizations. So in a worst case scenario, President Trump wouldn't necessarily need to use the FTO scheme. He could use the SDGT scheme that I was talking about earlier. And when that happens, well, I'm going to set aside, whatever entity is designated. Again, I'm never sure who we're talking about when we're talking about, quote unquote, the Muslim Brotherhood. But that entity would have its own avenues, either administrative or judicial, both of which are very restricted to challenge or do whatever it purported to do. With respect to American Muslim civil society, I think, it really would be to the extent people aren't already, to the extent people who are in the crosshairs or organizations with the crosshairs don't already know this, a set of measures and a set of steps to take beforehand in terms of protecting against investigation or the freezing or the consequences. And those measures would need to take into account the massive state authorities to conduct surveillance, to potentially freeze assets, to freeze access and assets to membership lists, property, bank accounts, abilities to communicate through email chains and networks. All of those would be what groups and entities should start thinking about now. That's for sort of targeted groups, and I'm not telling people who've been in the crosshairs anything that they don't know. For the rest of us, lawsuits, challenges, especially with respect to domestic consequences. But here I think there's something broader, right? This is part of why we need to do this work before, and many of us have talked about this, which is, or at least I, again, didn't expect to see in my lifetime, tens of thousands of people gathered at airports throughout this country, not just West Coast, not just East Coast, but throughout this country, and shouting for Muslims, let them in, right? That to me, without being a Pollyanna, because I'm not, represents something of a change. So what can we all do to capitalize on a time of justifiable and growing suspicion of bigoted executive action, and build the kinds of alliances and support that would have, honestly, people in the streets objecting to the vilification of us and our neighbors.
Question for Michael. You mentioned that, you said something sort of quickly that does counter the prevailing conventional wisdom on why people carry out acts of terror, which is this ideological radicalization process. If bad ideas aren't the problem, if criminalizing ideas isn't the solution, then how do we keep ourselves safe from terrorism? What is another approach versus the so-called idea of countering violent extremism by criminalizing ideas?
So nobody who studies terrorists, actual terrorists, people who commit terrorist crime, would argue with the idea that the vast majority of people who hold as odious a belief as you could imagine, Nazism, would never engage in any kind of criminal activity to further that ideology. That's just plain fact. It's easy. There are hundreds of thousands of neo-Nazis out there who go to marches and you go to protests, or don't even go to protests. Go online and spout their vile beliefs. A tiny handful of them actually commit violence. And if you look at the people who commit violence, some of them are people who went to protests, but a lot of them aren't, right? I mean, when I was undercover in neo-Nazi groups, there was a guy there who could, recite Hitler speeches from memory. There were a couple more who couldn't spell Hitler. There was a guy who really liked to make bombs, and this was a group that appreciated that talent and helped him develop that talent, right? He wasn't there because he thought there was any sort of race war that he wanted to start. He just liked making bombs, right? So you have to understand how the criminal element operates, not how the legitimate part of the group operates, right? I want them to have websites. I want them to have groups. I want them to have marches, right? One of the things that was interesting to me underground with the criminal element was they would support the groups having marches with the hope that they would get shut down. right? They would say, go have your march. You'll see you won't get a permit. You'll see protesters would shout you down and not give you an opportunity to speak. You'll see the police come out and shoo you away. And then you'll come to our side, right? And that's what instilled with me the recognition that those First Amendment freedoms that we give so we can express ourselves actually keep us safer by letting the other guy express his or herself, because it gives them a vent for what otherwise would generate some other behavior. So what we have to do is what we did in those cases. We didn't go out and try to stop a race war. We didn't go out and try to kill Nazism, right? We tracked evidence of illegal weapons transactions, right? These groups were trafficking in illegal firearms. So once we found the groups who were trafficking in illegal firearms, guess what? We also found groups who were trafficking in illegal identity documents. We also found groups who had actually done bombings, right? And you start with the criminals and you use evidence, not theories, not some concept that makes sense on a chalkboard but isn't what's reflected in reality. But also broaden the scope of what it is we're looking for, right? Terrorism typically results, with the exception of 9/11 in Oklahoma City that were mass casualty events, it's very rare for terrorism to take more than 50 or 100 people in the United States in a year. Extraordinarily rare, right? So more than 3,000 murderers go free every year. Tens of thousands of rapists go free every year that we don't even worry about, and somehow our society isn't terrorized by that, right? That's just something we acknowledge and live with. Well, if you look at the solve rates, in Boston, Massachusetts in 2011, the homicide solve rate was 37%, right? There was a triple homicide in Waltham, Massachusetts, which were probably the only 3 homicides in Waltham, Massachusetts, a bedroom community outside of Boston. They didn't get solved. Today, the government believes it was Tamerlan Tsarnaev who committed those murders. Now, I would argue that we shouldn't parse what websites he went to or what beliefs he held to determine if he was dangerous, which is what the FBI did in 2011 in assessing his dangerousness. I would say killing 3 people makes you dangerous, right? And if we had solved that homicide, if we put all these surveillance resources, imagine all of our phone metadata is being collected and analyzed, massive NSA programs, broad surveillance programs in cities like New York and by the FBI, racial mapping programs. How about solving homicides, right? That would have prevented the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing if we had solved that homicide. And I would guarantee, you look at the Paris attacks. It was fascinating because immediately all the pundits got up and said, oh, the arms they probably got from Syria and from Iraq, and there are rat lines to smuggle these arms. No, they got the arms from who? Anybody know? Criminal groups in Belgium, right? So if we had addressed the criminal groups in Belgium, we wouldn't have had at least as damaging as deadly a terrorist attack. This isn't rocket science. You focus on the criminal activity and you take away the tools criminals are allowed to use to hurt other people. And part of it is how we define terrorism, right? If somebody goes out and shoots up a movie theater and says it's because of the Batman movie, we say that's just crazy, right? And we don't worry about it. No policy implications, nothing. We just go on with our lives and say, oh, that's awful, but we'll live. If he references a white supremacist website, oh, hate crimes legislation. We need a policy response to this. If he references Islam, we have to bomb a foreign country, right? And it doesn't make sense. If you look at what those, what Omar Mateen, Dylan Roof, and James Holmes did, it was the same thing, right? They were angry about something, they didn't get adequate mental health treatment, and they had easy access to guns. As long as those things are true, we're going to have those kind of events. But to pretend those 3 things are different from a policy standpoint, it is our own problem, right? That's an own goal. We're creating a situation that doesn't actually exist. We can focus on what are the tools of criminality. and make it safe for everyone, because I want everyone to be safe from murderers and rapists as well as from terrorists. And that way our entire national security is improved, not just some concept of national security that doesn't include all of us. Sorry, that was a little long.
Question for you, Corey. Outside of the Muslim Brotherhood designation, what other vulnerabilities are there? Is there a risk to the Muslim civil society without the designation?
Without a doubt, the idea of overreach has impacted the Muslim community multiple times. So after the 9/11 attacks, you got the Patriot Act, and that piece of legislation was used to do significant damage to Muslim civil society. And I would say that in many ways is one of the things that the community lives with at this point. There are actors who are completely outside of the control of the community, excuse me, for whom we are held accountable. So Omar Mateen goes to a place in Florida and shoots it up based on whatever corrupt ideology he might have had. The entire community is held accountable for that and has to go on every national news network possible to distance themselves from him, even though a member of that same community had already pointed the FBI in the direction of Omar Mateen. So I would suggest to you that beyond the designation, one of the things that lies over the American Muslim community's head right now is this reality that somebody who is unknown, an individual who the community has no contact or influence over, could attempt to carry out some kind of an attack on the United States. And given the animus the current administration has expressed toward Muslims, given that there are a number of people in high-level positions within the White House who can influence policy in the aftermath of some tragedy, we could see some very significant targeting of all Muslims, as opposed to, as what Mike was pointing out, people going after people actually involved in criminal activity.
I think just to build on that, I think it's important not to downplay what's already happening, as we've just been talking about, right? So most people, I think, know of the NYPD's Muslim surveillance program, right? The concern is that claim authorities by the FBI could result in something that is even broader across the country. I think, the nation's, say, 11, 13 largest Muslim charities were shut down in the Bush years already, and that had a tremendous impact, negative one, on religious giving or the exercise of religious rights. Voluntary interview requests are happening constantly and targeting particular communities depending on events that might be happening abroad. So it's a web of surveillance and investigation and watch listing that already exists. It is, primarily focused in many ways on American Muslim communities right now, but it is also, and this is part of the interconnectedness things, it is also capturing or bringing out people who are in the Black Lives Matter movement who've been subjected to surveillance, people who are environmental activists, journalists. A lot of the same tools that are primarily targeted at this one community are also being used as they historically have been on other communities. And so it would be important to sort of not lose, to keep emphasizing that as well.
I'm gonna take two more of these questions and then we'll let everyone offer closing remarks before we end. They're both legal questions. So the first is, could you elaborate a bit on the consequence of the FBI being able to investigate an organization without factual predicate? how does that differ from the general domestic security and investigation restraints, or so-called Attorney General guidelines on the FBI? So that's one. And then related to that, can the U.S. still freeze assets before investigating, or did kind hearts and other cases stop that? Wasn't that district court? So two specific legal questions. Who would like to start? Those two.
So I'll address the FBI investigation Attorney General guidelines. These were amended several times after 9/11. These are the guidelines that were put in place after the Hoover era abuses were discovered in the 1970s. So Congress started moving to write legislation. Right now there is no legislation that limits the FBI's investigative authorities. So Congress started to move after the Hoover era abuses were uncovered, and the Attorney General, Edward Levy, stood in instead and said, I'll write guidelines for the Justice Department and that will govern the FBI. And they established a reasonable indication standard that absent a reasonable factual indication that somebody is breaking the law, the FBI should probably leave them alone. You know, when I was an agent working under that standard, it sort of made sense to me. You know, if I couldn't write down on a sheet of paper why I thought this person was committing some kind of crime that was within my jurisdiction, there were certainly worse people out there, right? Again, half of the violent crime goes unsolved, far greater white-collar crime and other crimes, right? There are criminals out there. So the idea of investigating somebody without that predicate is by definition unreasonable. But unfortunately, that's where we are. They were last changed in 2008, and the FBI was given a broad authority to conduct what are called assessments. With the language in the guidelines is really extraordinary, no factual predicate. So the FBI needs no belief that you are doing anything wrong to unleash a lot of very intensive tools to dig into your life. In the first 2 years the FBI had this authority, it opened 80,000 of these investigations. Only 3,400 of them actually found evidence to get to the next stage, which only requires, quote, information or an allegation, and the FBI agent, his or herself, is allowed to make the allegation, right? So the second standard is not high, and that such a small percentage for actually getting to that second standard, I think, is indicative of what a waste of resources this is. And Corey had mentioned that Omar Mateen, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, all these people had been under FBI investigation. So part of the problem is that they're doing so many of these investigations, the workload is just sapping their ability to distinguish one person from another, and they just open them and try to close them as quickly as they can, because by the time they get back to the office, there are going to be 3 more in their inbox that they have to address. So, unfortunately, after 9/11, there has been this idea that if the government gets more information, it will be more effective. But what we have seen time and time again, it's the mass of information, and this was the problem on 9/11, right? It wasn't that there was no information, it's that the information, according to the investigations that followed, was lost in the vast stream of data being collected on a daily basis. So unfortunately, that vast stream is now an ocean of data, and it's not making us safer.
I'll talk about kind hearts and the freeze or block pending investigation authority. So kind hearts, yes, absolutely was a district court decision and opinion. It is, so it never went further up, but I think it's worth reading and being familiar with because it's an extremely expansive and sophisticated analysis of the issues. The judge very much got into the jurisprudence of the Fourth Amendment and Fifth Amendment rights at stake and why they were squarely addressed here. And, you know, the government didn't appeal, and those freezes and blocks pending investigation stopped happening, and they weren't happening under the Obama administration. Could they happen again? Even though the court found that it was unconstitutional? Well, yes, because, you know, governments and administrations do wrongful things, unconstitutional things, and then they have to be challenged. We haven't seen a revision of the Treasury Department guidelines following the Kindhart's decision. At the very least, I think anyone seeking to do this within the White House or the Treasury Departments or other parts of government would be given pause. Kindhart's is a roadmap for what not to do if you're the government, and for courts to rule if the government does this and a challenge has to be brought. But it is by no means a good or perfect answer, right? We should all absolutely emphasize the unconstitutionality of this with respect to the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, but also recognize what is at stake, which is that when the block pending investigation happens, the organization is shut down. It is shut down. So litigation after the fact, and I've thought about what would one do, go into court straight away, or when it's potentially challenged. Goodness. Who's monitoring? That's a recognizably imperfect answer, right? Because the actual conduct can be so draconian, which is part of why it's important to keep emphasizing and making sure people know that this is and would be unconstitutional.
Okay, and now we'll just have closing remarks on maybe each panelist, starting with you, Angie.
So thank you. So in my opening remarks, I highlighted how this particular initiative, as well as those that we have characterized as the original and revised Muslim ban, are really part of a broader conservative effort to combat so-called radical Islam. And it's my viewpoint that this is really the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more initiatives, whether policy initiatives or legal initiatives, that are going to arise in the time to come. And as we confront those initiatives, whether or not we're lawyers, I think it's going to be significant for us to think about them critically and to ask about where is the evidence, right? Where is the evidence? And to keep things in perspective. So it might sound really scary to hear that 300 Muslims have been convicted of terrorist acts, and just hypothetically speaking, in the past 15 years, until you think about that there are 3 to 7 million Muslims in the United States, and that 99% of them have never been involved in violent extremism over the course of the past 15 years, right? So I think to think critically about the information with which we're being confronted with is really key, particularly in the context of this administration and this Congress as well.
Picking up on that as well, and it's my initial, we're in an era where people don't trust facts, right? They don't trust the media. But I would argue the pushback against this is that that facts are so contested shows how important they are. And so it becomes incumbent upon us to really make the case with data that is backed up and reliable, exactly as you're talking about, but that's not going to be enough, right? That's never going to be enough, and hasn't been. I think, among the other things, an insistence on people knowing their rights and making sure that rights and knowledge are available, and I think people have started doing a better job at that, in the various different languages. How are they most accessible? And recognizing what's at stake, right? Because it doesn't need something as draconian to come. Things can still incrementally take people's rights away or help erode them, right? So look at extreme vetting proposals that are coming down the pike. It's a version of Muslim bans that are more potentially incremental. Look at knowing rights when approached by law enforcement or in particular contexts. And really insisting also on claiming rights, right? Among the things, for all of us, right, not just targeted communities, among the things I would concretely say that impacted communities could do more of, and we all need to do a better job of, is information protection, right? Debates around encryption of communications have largely taken place among sort of elite tech levels, when I think all of us should be thinking about the ways in which our information and communications and lists and organizational membership lists might actually be, vulnerable. So thinking through and thinking about encryption, access to rights, what are the concrete means that we can all take to protect ourselves and each other against undue suspicion and surveillance? There's some real concrete ways to do it. I know you're starting to put some of this together. Multiple organizations are doing the same kind of thing, and to be able to spread that knowledge, I think, is critically important.
I'm going to assume, since Mike placed the microphone right in front of me, he was volunteering me to go next. Right after the Fort Hood shootings, I was speaking at an event, and a young man came up to me and looked me in the eye and said, "Don't you think what Nidal Hassam did was right?" And my first response was that that question was so ludicrous it had to be a setup, so I looked up to see where the video camera was, because I figured this is somebody setting me up. Then once I realized this young man was serious about that question, I looked at him and I said, "No, absolutely. Islam takes contracts very, very seriously. In this context, your citizenship in this country is your contract with this country that you must abide by, and that means obeying the laws of the country are something you must abide by. If you don't like what the U.S. is doing in Afghanistan, please go join the peace movement, because they really need the help." I point that out because that pause, looking for the camera, always comes to my mind. And while that's one, I have to go back to 2011 to think of an incident where I had a personal encounter with somebody who thought terrorism was a good idea. You also have things like CARE, the organization I work for, signing on to a letter that was directed to that was sent to the head of ISIS, deconstructing in a very academic way the way ISIS interprets Islam and inviting them back to mainstream Islam. I think when we're dealing with the real bad guys that Mike's talking about, that's the role you want Muslim organizations in. Talking to people face to face, writing letters, and that letter, by the way, resulted in ISIS including the head of our organization on a short list of people it would like to see assassinated in the United States, American Muslims. So you want us in that role. But instead, what these kind of threats, the position these kind of threats put us in, is distracting us from playing that role, because we have to deal with the threats coming to us from groups, devil-inspired groups like ISIS. We have to deal with the threats coming at us from far-right people who consistently threaten us, and we have to consider the threat to us from our own government for just going about the business of sticking up for the Constitution in this country. Because of our faith, we are classified as a threat. And I think that's a very, very problematic approach to the whole problem.
Thank you, and let me, because I'm last, say thanks to the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding for having this great talk, and my co-panelists for all the wisdom they have imparted to me, not just today, but over the course of the last 10 years. I think my request to you is going to be the hardest one. Obviously, what you heard today is that a lot of the idea around what the administration is doing, whether it's with the FTO designation of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the concept of radical Islam, or as the enemy, or the surveillance of communities, is around generating fear. And my request to you is not be afraid. You know, if you've done any study of psychology, what you'll find is that is a worthless request to make. So I'm going to change it a little bit. You know, the reason the government wants you afraid is because it gives them power, right? And we have ceded a tremendous amount of power to our intelligence and law enforcement agencies without accountability, right? You know, I had a friend who said to me, I'm not doing anything wrong, so I don't care if the government is collecting information about me. I said, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, will the government's collection of information about you help them stop terrorists or criminals? And she said, no. And I said, then why does the government want that information? And she said, why does the government want that information? So I would like you to be more afraid of unaccountable government than afraid of anything else, because I think that's the thing that is going to create more insecurity for all Americans in the long run. I have been blessed at the Brennan Center to work with Rich Schwartz, who is Chief Counsel for the Church Committee. Bert Wise is here. That 1975 effort was the last comprehensive examination of our intelligence community. Right? In 1974, terrorists blew up an airliner in LaGuardia Airport and killed 11 Americans. Somehow we were still able to hold the agencies accountable. And in the time since then, the number of terrorist attacks came down. We can have security and accountable government, and that's what we should demand.
Thank you all so much, first, for being here, for your attention, and to all the panelists. And if you want to learn more, please visit our website at ispu.org/MB designation. Thanks a lot.